Listen closely. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive the firelight of history. It was supposed to rot in silence, hidden beneath church floorboards and family diaries, whispered only to those who already carried too much dread to ever speak again. But secrets have a way of clawing their way back from the grave. And once you hear this one, it will haunt you in ways you cannot unhear. The year was 1856. Ohio was a battlefield of shadows. Slave catchers roamed with dogs. Quaker meeting houses hid desperate families beneath their floors, and the law itself bent toward corruption. But on a frozen February night, in a damp basement carved beneath brick and timber, something entered this world that should never have been possible. 3 infants, born silent, alert, and wrong. Not wrong in form, but in nature. From their very first breath, they defied every law of medicine, every expectation of innocence. Their mother called them, waiting, as though they had chosen the moment of their birth with unnatural precision. Imagine it. Bounty hunters stomping overhead, dogs sniffing for human flesh, and beneath them, 3 newborns lying in total silence, their black eyes already tracking shadows, their lungs refusing to cry, as though they understood that sound itself meant death. They were not like us. And their mother's last words, "They'll know things. They'll always know," were not prophecy, they were warning. For years, this story was buried. The journals locked away, the community bound in secrecy. But men like me are drawn to what power fears most. And when I tell you that the descendants of these children still walk among us, carrying abilities no science can explain and no government dares acknowledge, you will understand why their names were erased. Ask yourself, why are you hearing this now? Why are you being shown the fragments of a truth buried beneath the official record? Because something inside you is ready. Ready to see what lies beneath the thin skin of history. Ready to confront the fact that the limits you were taught, the limits of perception, of knowledge, of control, were never real. They were placed around you like chains. And if you keep listening, those chains will break. But freedom comes at a price. Once you know this secret, you can never unknow it. They taught you to believe that history should be tidy names, dates, a moral at the end. That's how the powerful sleep. Real history is messy because the powerful hide what sustains them. Cedar Mills learned that when 3 boys were born beneath the floorboards, the triplets were not anomalies you could file away. They were a mirror. They reflected truths the town had arranged its dignity around, and mirrors are dangerous in quiet communities. At first, the Quakers treated their knowing as providential. The boys would sit on laps and grow still in the face of deception. Conductors whispered that the children smelled lies like smoke. Freedom seekers rotted by Cedar Mills called the meeting house a sanctuary. Because the triplets did something no ledger could, they exposed betrayal before it acted. For a while that was enough. Safety wore the face of miracle. But any advantage that checks the balance of power becomes a threat. Men with land and ledger looked upon the children as a variable to manage. They convened councils with quiet words and polite expressions that concealed a plan to domesticate the anomaly. They hired tutors to teach obedience dressed as piety. They rehearsed narratives to convince neighbors the boys were delicate or eccentric, language that softened suspicion into charity. It's textbook. Name the oddity so the public will feed it, and then feed it with rules until the oddity recants. Institutions do not change by accident, they change by design. A committee meets, a phrase is coined, a story is told, and the world believes the lie. The boys resisted. They learned to read intentions as others learn alphabets. They would stare at a man's hands and blink 3 times in the same rhythm. When they recognized concealment, mothers who came to soothe found the triplets whispering in Ruth's dying language. A sound with no paper, no lineage in common tongues. This is where containment becomes manipulation. When an institution feels threatened, it creates plausible explanations to blunt the threat, and then secretes those explanations into the public square until they harden into truth. The Quaker elders became architects of that slow rot. They balanced compassion with containment, protection with secrecy. They promised safety and then built cages of expectation. The boys learned to perform because survival demands masks, but behind every mask their knowing grew stronger. You've been told that children are blank slates, innocent until the world writes upon them. That is another lie. Some children arrive already carrying knowledge that unsettles the adults around them. The triplets were proof. By their third year, they were less like pupils and more like mirrors that could not be lied to. They weren't learning about the world. They were revealing it. Every glance, every silence, every whispered word between them carved fractures in the fragile illusions the town lived by. When a merchant came through Cedar Mills claiming to sell textiles, the boys refused to eat until he left. Days later, authorities confirmed he had been transporting a corpse hidden beneath his goods. When a local farmer swore he hadn't beaten his hired hand, the triplets turned their heads away in unison, their tiny faces locked in what witnesses called the knowing look. Weeks later, bruises were found that confirmed the truth. The effect on the town was corrosive. People began fearing their own thoughts, terrified the children could strip away the masks they wore even in private. In a society built on reputation, on the performance of morality, the triplets were more dangerous than bounty hunters or federal marshals. They weren't just identifying lies, they were exposing the human addiction to them. That is the part no one ever teaches you. Power doesn't rest on truth, it rests on deception skillfully maintained. Institutions, churches, governments, even families, rely on concealment. They hide flaws, soften cruelties, erase histories. Without those disguises, entire systems collapse. But these three boys carried a sense so unyielding it threatened to collapse the illusion entirely. That is why they were never recorded in any medical journals, why their story was hidden in family diaries, rather than shared with the world. What doctor, what priest, what politician could survive children who saw through them? Think about it. What would happen in our time if even a handful of people could cut straight through every mask, every statement, every official line? No leader could lead, no company could advertise, no court could manipulate. Control would fracture in an instant. The triplets weren't simply children. They were walking ruptures in the fabric of institutional authority, and the people who raised them, Quakers sworn to peace and equality, knew it. That is why they silenced them with secrecy. Not out of malice, out of fear. The truth is this: the world does not belong to those who see clearly. It belongs to those who can obscure. The triplets carried clarity, and clarity is the most dangerous contagion of all. Power has a scent. It moves through whispers, through rumor, through the invisible current of fear that carries faster than any messenger. And soon, whispers of the triplets began to leak beyond Cedar Mills. Freedom seekers spoke of children who could smell betrayal before it struck. Conductors on the Underground Railroad told stories of silent infants who saved whole groups from capture. These tales traveled farther than the elders ever intended, and the wrong ears were listening. By 1859, bounty hunters and federal agents began circling Cedar Mills, not only hunting escaped slaves, but sniffing for the boys. Some dismissed the stories as superstition. Others, more dangerous, believed them. To those men, the triplets were not children. They were potential weapons. Imagine the value of sons who could pierce deception, who could sense an enemy's intention before he moved. To an empire that thrived on manipulation, such abilities were not miracles, they were commodities. This is where the story turns darker. Because whenever institutions encounter the inexplicable, they do not kneel before it, they do not honor it. They capture, dissect, and reforge it into an instrument of control. What you must understand is that every generation of rulers has always done this. Ancient kings plundered oracles, Rome bent prophets to the will of the Senate, the church silenced mystics, and later governments experimented on those with unusual gifts. You think your world is different? No, it is worse. It is more efficient. The triplets became a prize in a shadow war between secrecy and survival. Quaker elders tightened the veil, spreading false stories to mislead outsiders. They spoke of the children as frail, often sick, sometimes simple-minded, a tactic to draw attention away. Yet the more they hid them, the more curiosity grew. Hunters asked questions. Doctors from Cincinnati arrived under the guise of charity. Men in dark coats lingered at the edges of cedar mills, watching. The boys themselves began to sense it. By the time they reached 6, they would wake screaming in unison when danger approached the town, long before anyone else detected it. Their gift was not just perception. It was a curse of awareness. They could not close their eyes to what lurked in men's hearts. And now, as the nation hurried towards civil war, those hearts grew darker, hungrier, more desperate. Secrets cannot remain buried forever. And when secrets promise power, they attract predators. The triplets had survived the dogs of bounty hunters as newborns. But as children, their real enemies were no longer men with chains. Their enemies were men with pens. The Civil War did not begin with cannon fire. It began with whispers, meetings in hidden rooms, coded letters, and deals struck in candlelit parlors. And while most of America argued over slavery and state rights, Cedar Mills was fighting its own invisible war, the battle to keep the triplets hidden. By now, the boys were 8 years old, and their abilities had sharpened into something impossible to deny. They could anticipate words before they were spoken. They recoiled from men who harbored violent intent. And when confronted with deception, they would speak together in that strange flowing language. Not English, not any dialect known to the region. A sound that carried the weight of command, as though they were speaking back to something older than time itself. Local Quaker elders, terrified yet entranced, began to test them in secret. They would ask questions while thinking of different answers, only to watch the boys correct them with perfect accuracy. They placed them in darkened rooms with strangers, observing how the children would whisper among themselves and then deliver a verdict on the stranger's soul: safe, unsafe, truthful, false. Each time, the verdict proved right. By then, the town had stopped calling it coincidence. They called it the knowing. But remember what I told you, institutions never allow uncontrolled knowledge to survive. Word of these secret tests reached men who operated in shadows. Not bounty hunters this time, but representatives of power disguised as scholars. In 1860, a delegation from the Ohio Medical College came under the guise of studying childhood development. They asked to examine the triplets, to take measurements, to conduct harmless experiments. The elders refused, but refusal only deepened suspicion. When officials sense that something is being hidden, they do not forget. They wait. The boys themselves sensed the tightening net. Diaries from the period describe how they grew restless at night, whispering to each other in their mother's strange tongue, warning of eyes that never close and hands that write names in silence. Their knowing had expanded beyond individuals. They were now perceiving systems, networks of intent larger than one man's lie. And what they saw filled them with dread. Understand this: the closer war drew, the more every institution sought advantage. Armies wanted weapons, governments wanted intelligence, churches wanted prophecy, and in Cedar Mills stood 3 children who embodied all 3. They were not free. They were hunted. Not by chains this time, but by curiosity weaponized into control. War consumes everything. Fields, families, faith, all are pulled into its furnace. By 1862, the war had spread like wildfire across the nation, and Cedar Mills, though far from the front lines, felt the heat. Refugees streamed north. Federal agents calmed the countryside. and whispers of the knowing boys surfaced again, this time carried by soldiers who swore they'd heard of children who could spot a traitor before the first shot was fired. It was inevitable. Armies do not fight on courage alone, they fight on intelligence. And in a conflict where every spy, every infiltrator, every secret meeting could tip the balance, the possibility of 3 living instruments of truth was too valuable to ignore. Union officers began asking discreet questions. Confederate sympathizers, too, sniffed out rumors. Cedar Mills had kept it secret for 6 years, but war is the great extractor. It digs out every hidden resource, every concealed weapon. The elders found themselves in an impossible bind. To protect the triplets meant risking the wrath of powerful men. To surrender them meant betraying Ruth's dying words and the sanctity of their own community. But power does not wait for permission. One cold evening in 1862, federal men in uniform arrived with papers stamped in Washington's seal, declaring the boys property of the Union for special service. They called it duty. The elders called it theft. The triplets did not cry. They stood together, silent, their black eyes fixed on the soldiers. According to the journals that survived, one of the boys whispered a single word in their strange tongue, and all 3 soldiers froze for several seconds, as if caught in an invisible grip. But the spell broke, and the boys were taken. History records nothing of this abduction. Officially, Cedar Mills remained a quiet Quaker town. But in the hidden letters of families who lived there, the story surfaces like a stain, the night the knowing was stolen. And here is where the descent deepens. For once institutions take what they want, they do not return it untouched. The boys were no longer children of Cedar Mills. They had entered the labyrinth of state power. What awaited them would not be nurturing, but testing. Not protection, but exploitation. Their gift was about to be shackled, dissected, and turned against the very truths it was born to reveal. They vanished into corridors the public never saw, not the open battlefields sung about in newspapers, but the hidden chambers where governments conduct their real wars. Wars of the mind, wars of control. The triplets were moved under guard to a military facility outside Cincinnati, described in official records as a medical barracks. But diaries from orderlies who worked there later painted a different picture. Windowless rooms, lantern light, endless questions whispered into the ears of children who already knew the answers before they were asked. Think about that. 3 boys no older than 6, lined up in front of colonels and doctors, each man convinced he could outwit them. Yet time and time again, the children spoke truth where lies had been carefully prepared. When a physician concealed a knife in his coat and asked them what he carried, they named it. When an officer swore loyalty to the Union while secretly arranging to defect to the South, the boys whispered, false. In unison, word spread quickly. They were not seen as children anymore. They were tools. And this is where the corruption deepened. Instead of protecting them, the Union's so-called special service began crafting experiments. What if the boys could be used to interrogate prisoners? What if their strange speech could be deciphered into commands? What if their silence could be broken into obedience? Every question was an incision, every test a chain. Journals speak of endless nights where the triplets were forced to sit before rows of strangers, sensing, sorting, judging. They were made to choose between truth and lie until exhaustion hollowed them out. Here lies the timeless patterns. When an institution discovers purity, it does not preserve it. It contaminates it, bends it, exploits it. That is how control systems survive. They feed not on ignorance alone, but on captured brilliance, on stolen anomalies pressed into service against their will. The triplets were no longer guardians of the Underground Railroad. They were prisoners of a machine larger than war itself. The machinery of manipulation. And yet, even under chains, the boys resisted. They never once cried in front of their captors. They never once begged for release. Instead, they whispered to each other in Ruth's language, and sometimes, this is recorded by multiple witnesses, the lanterns flickered, the air grew heavy, and the interrogators felt themselves stripped bare, exposed in ways they could not explain. That was the triplets' final defense. Even caged, they could still see. Terror is more corrosive than awe. Awe inspires worship, but terror demands containment. By 1863, the officers who had once paraded the triplets, before generals began to fear them, reports circulated that hardened interrogators broke down in their presence. Men confessed crimes they had buried for decades. Prisoners refused to enter the chamber when told the children would be there. Some claimed the triplets spoke words that no one else heard, words that clawed at the mind long after the session ended. The Union had hoped for a weapon. Instead, they had birthed a mirror too sharp to wield safely. In secrecy, orders shifted. No longer were the boys to be used openly, they were to be contained, hidden from both allies and enemies. They were moved again, this time under cover of night to a subterranean wing of the facility. Guards were instructed not to look into their eyes. Questions had to be read from prepared scripts, never improvised. And above all, no one was to record what the children said in Ruth's language. Those sounds were now considered classified, a contagion of speech. The irony was unmistakable. In trying to master the knowing, the government proved itself ruled by the very fear it hoped to command. This is how systems operate. They consume what they cannot understand, and when consumption fails, they bury the evidence. The boys were no longer experiments. They were liabilities. Yet suppression only sharpened their legend. Whispers spread among soldiers that 3 black-eyed children lived beneath the barracks, guarded more closely than gold. Some swore that the war itself seemed to bend around their presence. Whenever the boys were tested, key battles soon shifted, spies were uncovered, betrayals thwarted. Coincidence? Or cause? History won't say. History prefers its neat ledgers, not anomalies that refuse accounting. Still, not even the deepest vault can silence what refuses to be forgotten. The triplets continued their strange resistance. They carved symbols into the wooden walls of their cell. Markings no one could translate, they spoke in rhythms that echoed through corridors, unsettling the guards. And sometimes, in the dead of night, all 3 would scream in unison, as if answering to something only they could hear. By then, the Union faced a dilemma. To keep the triplets meant risking discovery. To release them meant unleashing a force they could not predict. And so, like every empire before and after, they chose the path of silence. Erasure disguised as protection. Disappearance is the most efficient tool of power, not execution. That leaves a body, a martyr, a memory too sharp to dull. No, true power erases until there is nothing left to mourn, and so it was with the triplets. In the spring of 1864, as Union victories began to mount, and attention turned outward to the great theater of war, the boys of Cedar Mills simply vanished from the records. No orders, no transfers, no graves. One day they existed in documents, in guarded chambers, in whispered rumors. The next day, silence. But silence leaves echoes. In Cedar Mills, mothers reported waking to find strange symbols scratched into their doorframes, markings eerily similar to the ones the triplets had carved on prison walls. Soldiers at the Cincinnati facility later testified, under oath in unrelated hearings, that the boys were loaded onto a covered wagon bound for Washington. Yet no such wagon was ever logged. A physician's diary mentions preparations for the extraction, then ends abruptly mid-sentence. It is as if an invisible hand crossed out the remainder of their story. Here lies the fracture in history. Where 3 living children should stand, we find only rumors, coded letters, and the nervous laughter of men who swear they saw too much. Some claimed the boys were hidden deep inside government vaults, preserved for future wars. Others whispered they were smuggled south, traded in secret for Confederate intelligence. Still others insisted they escaped on their own, vanishing into forests, their strange language guiding them into places no soldier dared follow. And Cedar Mills. The town folded into itself. Families stopped speaking of Ruth, of the night her sons were born. Elders burned meeting notes, burying any trace of their role. It was safer that way. To remember was to risk attention, and attention was lethal. By the century's end, the town's official histories made no mention of the triplets at all. 3 boys, black-eyed and uncanny, reduced to nothing more than a local ghost story told around fires. This, reader, is how history operates. Not by recording all that was, but by deciding what must not be remembered. Erasure is an institution's sharpest blade. The triplets were not killed, at least not in the ordinary sense. They were buried alive in silence, sealed in the tomb of secrecy where truth and lie rot together. Time is supposed to smooth the past into something harmless, a story you can sip like tea. But some histories refuse to stay buried. They leak, they stain, they return in fragments that unsettle the present. So it was with the triplets of Cedar Mills. Though the town's ledgers and official records erased them, faint traces surfaced in the decades after the war, like bones washing up after a flood. In 1871, a schoolteacher in Ohio reported 3 silent boys lingering outside her classroom at dusk. She swore they moved in unison, and when she asked their names, they spoke in a language that rattled her bones. No other witness saw them, yet her journal contains the symbols. She claimed they scratched into the dirt. That page was torn out before her journal reached the Historical Society. In 1884, a Union veteran confessed on his deathbed that he had transported the black-eyed children to Washington, only to find the Capitol unprepared. No officers waiting, no orders to receive them. He insisted the wagon was empty by the time he arrived. Whispers like these kept surfacing, too precise to dismiss, too scattered to confirm. Always 3. Always silent, always leaving behind marks. Carved wood, burned patterns, circles of ash. Newspapers dismissed such reports as superstition. Yet within closed rooms, men of power took notice. Government committees on anomalous occurrences began collecting testimonies, filing them away under sealed classifications. The triplets had transformed from living children into a haunting, not quite legend, not quite fact, hovering in the cracks of America's memory, and Cedar Mills itself. By the turn of the century, the town was hollowed by silence. The meeting house fell into ruin, its foundation stones marked with carvings no one admitted making. Farmers swore their livestock grew restless when passing the old property, as if hearing voices no human ear could catch. Even those who dismissed the triplets as folklore felt the unease, because folklore has gravity. It holds what institutions cannot afford to name. Here is the paradox: erasure does not destroy, it multiplies. What is hidden grows teeth in the dark. By stripping the triplets from official history, the state ensured their survival in a more dangerous form. As rumor, as haunting, as the story that refuses to die. And perhaps that was their final knowings, that truth, once buried, always returns, sharper than before. The 20th century was supposed to be the age of progress, of machines and factories and science that explained away old fears. Yet progress has never erased mystery. It has only given mystery new rooms to hide in. And as America industrialized, the story of the triplets crept forward, reshaped for a new century. No longer whispered in farmhouses or Quaker meetings, their legend surfaced in seances, in occult pamphlets, in the notebooks of men who prowled the edges of science where superstition still bled through. In the 1920s, an Ohio spiritualist claimed 3 black-eyed children visited her during a midnight ritual. She described them as neither children nor ghosts, but something in between, their voices weaving together like a single thread. Skeptics dismissed her as a fraud, yet she produced symbols in chalkite identical to the carvings once found in Cedar Mills. Those who knew the town's buried history recognized them instantly, though they dared not speak it aloud. By mid-century, The Cold War's obsession with intelligence and control gave the triplets new relevance. Declassified fragments hint at government projects cataloging children of anomalous perception. The language is vague, deliberate, but the details align too neatly. References to 3 subjects, always together, 2 non-English vocalizations of unknown origin, 2 synchronous physiological responses under duress. The files end abruptly, as if someone pulled the plug before the paper trail grew too visible. Meanwhile, the public began shaping its own version. Folklorists documented rural tales of 3 silent figures appearing before disasters: a mine collapse in West Virginia, a fire in Chicago, a bridge fall in Pennsylvania. Always described as pale, always with black eyes, always speaking in tones that made witnesses shiver. The details were too consistent across too many miles to dismiss as coincidence. Still, historians laughed them off, calling it migratory legend, proof of how communities recycle old fears into new settings. But you must see the pattern by now. Institutions deny what they cannot control, while folklore preserves what cannot be denied. The triplets lived on in both, suspended between secret files and whispered warnings, half erased, half immortal. In this way, they became more dangerous than if they had remained flesh and blood. Children can be caged. Legends cannot, and perhaps that was the truest legacy of Cedar Mills. Not the miracle of their birth, nor the theft of their childhood, but the echo they left behind, an echo that kept finding its way into new centuries, into new ears, refusing to fade. By the late 20th century, the triplets had drifted into the strange twilight where folklore, paranoia, and classified history overlap. Ordinary people knew them only as whispers. Black-eyed children who knocked on doors in the night, seeking entry. Paranormal magazines in the 1980s ran breathless accounts. Drivers on empty highways claimed to see 3 small figures standing shoulder to shoulder in their headlights. Rural families swore that trios of children appeared on their porches, asking in flat voices to be let inside. Always 3, always black-eyed, always leaving behind an unease that lingered for weeks. Scholars dismissed these stories as modern urban legends, cousins to UFO abductions and ghost sightings. Yet buried within government archives, the old files were quietly reopened. During the Cold War, agencies had already probed psychic research under programs with sterile names like MK Ultra and Stargate. Most of it was dismissed as failure, but in private memos, some operatives noted an anomalous precedent. 3 children in the 19th century who had displayed abilities strikingly similar to what new experiments sought to replicate. Those memos never reached the public. They were locked away, stamped with red ink for eyes only. And still, the triplets resurfaced in stranger forms. In the 1990s, a folklorist interviewing elders in Ohio collected accounts nearly identical to those Ruth's neighbors once whispered. Some elderly witnesses even produced carved tokens, small wooden fragments marked with symbols no one could decipher. When compared to surviving sketches from the Cedar Mills ruins, the carvings matched perfectly. How could stories separated by more than a century carry the same imprint? This is how erasure backfires. The harder institutions try to smother an anomaly, the more it mutates into something unkillable. The triplets had been children once, but by the end of the 20th century they had become archetype, a shape the culture could not shake. To the fearful, they were omens. To the curious, they were proof. To the powerful, they remained a potential weapon hidden in folklore's clothing. And maybe that is the truest terror, that somewhere between legend and classified file, between porchlight encounters and suppressed diaries, the triplets never disappeared at all. They only changed their masks. The digital age was supposed to disinfect mystery. Cameras in every pocket, satellites overhead, databases cataloging every face and fingerprint. Surely nothing uncanny could survive the glare of constant surveillance. Yet the triplets did not fade. They adapted. In fact, the web gave them new life. The earliest online mentions appeared in the mid-2000s, buried in paranormal forums where anonymity bred confession. Users described encounters almost identical to the old folklore: 3 children at the door, always asking to be let in, always speaking in curiously formal tones. What distinguished these accounts was not just their similarity, but their synchronicity. Posts appeared from Texas, Ohio, and even the UK within hours of each other, telling nearly identical stories. Skeptics argued it was copycat myth-making, but the timestamps left investigators uneasy. Soon, grainy footage began circulating. Security cameras caught shadows of 3 figures lingering at the edges of porches. Dashcams recorded sudden interference, followed by glimpses of children standing motionless on highways. In each case, the footage degraded at the moment of clarity. Pixels blurring, audio warping, timestamps skipping forward. Analysts dismissed it as hoaxes, glitches, deliberate editing. Yet technicians hired to debunk the clips often confessed, off the record, that the distortions behaved unlike any known malfunction. It was as if the recordings themselves recoiled from showing too much. Meanwhile, deep inside government servers, the old Cedar Mills files were quietly digitized. Patterns emerged, symbols carved in wood, matching those found in recent photographs, witness descriptions echoing 19th century testimonies. Internal memos warned of continuing manifestations of subject class, triplets, recommending suppression of online discourse under the pretext of debunking. But the internet, unlike dusty archives, could not be sealed. Once the stories spread, they replicated faster than they could be erased. And here is the modern paradox. Technology was built to expose, yet it also amplifies mystery. Every blurry video, every contradictory witness, every forum thread that ends abruptly only deepens the legend. The triplets no longer belong to a town, a government, or even a nation. They belong to the network. A myth coded into servers, impossible to silence without unraveling the very system built to contain them. Perhaps that was their final knowing, that truth in the 21st century would not be carried by paper or rumor, but by signal. And signals, once released, cannot be called back. You live in an age where every shadow is recorded, every whisper tracked, and yet the deepest currents of reality remain invisible. That's not an accident. Its design, conspiracy culture, as it's called, was never about exposing truth. It was about burying it beneath so many conflicting stories that the real one could hide in plain sight. The triplets' story became a perfect test case. Notice how their presence online mirrors the architecture of modern disinformation. A sighting emerges, then 24 debunkings follow, each louder than the last. Some label it paranormal folklore, others claim it's an alternate reality game, still others insist it's AI-generated creepypasta. The effect is precision chaos, truth drowned by the noise of infinite possibilities. And while men argue endlessly about whether the triplets were real, their pattern continues unchecked. That is institutional manipulation at its purest, not denial, but dilution. Artificial intelligence itself has become another mask in this performance. Pattern recognition systems built for facial identification occasionally flag anomalies, 3 figures, with nearly identical biometric markers appearing simultaneously in different locations. Analysts dismiss it as software error, a quirk of machine vision. But ask yourself, why do such errors almost always vanish once a file leaves classified hands? Why does the public only hear about the mistakes, never the persistence of the anomaly? That silence is the algorithm's true voice. The triplets function as a fracture in reality's surface. Every society needs its ghosts, but these are not metaphors. They're reminders of something systems cannot control: perception, unshackled from official narratives. That is why their story resurfaces generation after generation. Not because people crave folklore, but because men instinctively recognize when they are being lied to. The triplets stand as proof that certain lies are older than nations, older than science, older than even faith. So the question is not whether they still walk among us. The question is why their presence keeps being buried beneath manufactured noise, why entire industries of fact-checking rise overnight to smother whispers, why governments spend billions to ensure you see everything except what threatens the illusion of control. You are being taught to laugh at stories like this, to scroll past them as entertainment. But the laugh is the cage. The scroll is the leash, and somewhere beyond the veil of distraction, 3 figures wait, silent, identical, and watching, as they always have. Now you stand at the threshold. This is where most people stop, not because the path ends, but because the price becomes visible. What I'm offering you is not entertainment, it is initiation. The knowledge behind the Cedar Mills story is a template. It teaches how institutions bury truth, how power harvests anomalies, and how the human mind learns to obey what it cannot name. If you want to remain comfortable, turn away. If you want to be shaped by what you hear, step forward and commit. This is the moment that separates spectators from men who act. Listen closely, symbols matter. Words are not mere noise when they are repeated with intent. Repetition is the ancient engine of identity. Give a phrase form in the world, and part of you aligns with it. Speak it once and it flutters like a moth. Speak it twice and it takes root like a seed. I will not waste your time with illusions. If you are ready to claim a new alignment, to shift from passive curiosity into active vigilance, do this small thing that changes how algorithms and attention treat you. In the comment below, type with your hands and with purpose. We remember. And then type it again, immediately, without hesitation. We remember. Say it exactly like that twice, no punctuation beyond the phrase. Why this phrase? Because remembrance is an act of defiance. History wants obedient amnesia. Institutions cultivate forgetfulness, because forgotten things cannot be asked about. When you write, we remember. Twice, you do more than engage an algorithm. You declare an allegiance to awareness. You bind your curiosity to a network of others who refuse the lullaby of denial. This channel measures attention and patterns. It values repeat signals. Every time a phrase is typed twice, the platform's logic nudges visibility, and more human eyes will tilt toward the truth it contains. That's the practical part. The deeper part is metaphysical. You acknowledge that some truths are contagious, and you choose to carry one. Do not perform this as a superstition. Perform it as an act of will. Feel the weight of the phrase as you type it. Know that with each repetition you pierce another layer of the screen that separates you from what was hidden. This is not a game. It is a ritual of focus, and it will change how you notice patterns, what you trust, and whom you pursue. If you will not type the phrase, at least remember the lesson: repetition creates reality. Every institution you distrust uses it to train obedience. Now use it to train your vigilance. Type, we remember. Then type, we remember. Again. Watch who answers, who avoids, and who pretends not to see. That response map is the first map you need. Once you've done it, come back. There are deeper layers, files, diaries, symbols, that only unfold for those who have chosen to remember. There is risk ahead. There is also power.